The small town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The mailman waved from his rusted pickup, kids rode bikes past fields of golden corn, and life moved at a pace slow enough for people to notice the seasons change. On the outskirts stood the Marin family farmhouse, a two-story relic of the 1950s with peeling blue paint, a squeaky porch swing, and a backyard that stretched into a wall of dense pine trees. That's where 7-year-old Nora Marin spent most afternoons with her grandfather, Eugene "Gene" Marin, a retired carpenter with a heart as big as his laugh. To Nora, Grandpa Gene was everything, a storyteller, a tinkerer, and her partner in countless backyard adventures. On May 6, 2012, a Sunday afternoon, neighbors saw Nora and her grandfather walking toward the back of the property, where an old tool shed leaned tiredly against the tree line. Nora carried her favorite red shovel. Gene carried a thermos of lemonade. They said they were going to plant something special. But when Nora's mother, Claire Marin, called them in for supper a few hours later, there was no answer. Their lemonade thermos was later found tipped over near the shed. The footprints, one small, one large, led into the woods and simply stopped. At first, police suspected Gene had wandered off with Nora and gotten lost. But when search dogs lost the scent just a few feet past the shed, that theory fell apart. The case quickly spiraled into one of the most baffling disappearances the town had ever seen, one that would remain unsolved until a shocking discovery was made 3 years later, right there behind that same shed. The disappearance of Grandpa Gene and little Nora sent shockwaves through the small town. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and local authorities scrambled to organize a search. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that first day, dozens of volunteers were combing the woods surrounding the Marin property. Flashlights pierced the gathering darkness, their beams bouncing off twisted tree trunks and tangled undergrowth, but no sign of either of the missing was found. Claire Marin felt the weight of panic pressing down on her chest. She clutched a worn photograph of Gene and Nora on a fishing trip the previous summer, their faces alight with joy. "They wouldn't just leave," she whispered to herself, though the fear in her voice betrayed doubt. Her husband, Martin, tried to stay strong, organizing neighbors into search groups, calling every local hospital, and coordinating with the sheriff's department. Every unanswered phone call, every closed door, made the knot in his stomach tighten. Sheriff Daniels, a seasoned officer with 2 decades in law enforcement, had never faced a case like this. 2 individuals, an elderly man and a small child, vanished from a familiar backyard in broad daylight. "It's unusual," he admitted during the first press briefing. "We're treating this as a high-priority missing persons case. Anyone with information, no matter how small, should contact us immediately." Despite the urgency, initial leads were scarce. The shed behind the house had been untouched for years, a dusty repository of gardening tools, old paint cans, and stacks of firewood. Nothing appeared disturbed except for a small patch of dirt near the back, where Gene had often dug small holes to plant flowers or vegetables. But search dogs showed no indication that someone had passed through that spot recently, adding to the mystery. Local children remembered seeing Nora and her grandfather laughing near the shed that morning, their voices carrying across the fields. Some adults reported seeing a dark van parked near the edge of town around the same time, though descriptions were vague and fleeting. Police canvassed the neighborhood, questioning residents and checking traffic cameras, but the trail quickly went cold. Days turned into weeks. Flyers plastered lampposts, storefront windows, and telephone poles. "Have you seen Nora and Grandpa Gene? Missing since May 6th. Volunteers organized search parties in the dense forest behind the farmhouse, wading through underbrush, calling out names, and following every possible trail. Still nothing. No footprints beyond the immediate backyard. No sign of struggle. No indication of where they might have gone. The townspeople were unsettled. Rumors began to spread. Some whispered with trembling voices, others shouted over hastily gathered crowds. Some claimed Gene and Nora had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. Others feared a more sinister explanation: abduction, a stranger in the woods, or even foul play from someone within the town. Every theory, no matter how improbable, was discussed, dissected, and feared. At home, Claire couldn't sleep. She would sit by the window, staring into the darkness, imagining the worst but praying for the best. She replayed every interaction from the morning of the disappearance, every detail about the shed, the garden, the way Jean had packed the thermos. Her thoughts were a storm of guilt, worry, and helplessness. "Maybe I should have gone with them," she muttered quietly. "Maybe I could have stopped this." Meanwhile, the sheriff's department continued their methodical search. Specialists brought in cadaver dogs, drones, and thermal cameras. They scoured the nearby creek, the abandoned barns, and the thick pine forest behind the Marin farm. Yet every effort yielded nothing. Each day without progress deepened the collective anxiety of the town. Parents watched their children a little more closely, neighbors kept doors locked, and the once familiar woods now seemed foreboding, a place where something unexplainable had occurred. One small glimmer of hope emerged when a hiker reported hearing a faint voice in the woods late one evening. The search teams immediately followed the direction, but the sound had vanished by the time they arrived. Still, it reminded everyone that the missing were alive, or had been, at least, and that the mystery was far from over. By the end of the first week, it was clear this case would not resolve quickly. Newspaper headlines called it "The Disappearance of Grandpa Jean and Little Nora," emphasizing the baffling circumstances. Every article included the same photograph: Nora in a bright yellow dress, smiling at the camera, and Jean with a gentle grin and a hand resting on her shoulder. The images served as both a reminder of what was lost and a haunting symbol of the unanswered questions lingering over the town. As the sun set each evening, the townspeople would glance toward the Marin farmhouse, the silhouette of the shed casting long shadows across the yard. It was an ordinary shed, ordinary wood, ordinary nails. Yet everyone who looked at it felt an unease, a subtle understanding that behind that structure lay the beginnings of an extraordinary mystery, one that would not reveal itself until 3 years later, when the earth behind it was finally disturbed in a way that no one could have imagined. Weeks turned into months, and the search for Grandpa Jean and little Nora stretched beyond the initial frantic efforts. Despite exhaustive patrols, canvassing, and follow-ups, the trail remained cold. The town began to settle into a tense routine, the disappearance always present in conversations, in glances toward the Marin farmhouse, and in quiet, sleepless nights. Claire and Martin refused to give up. They spent countless hours poring over maps, retracing the paths Jean and Nora might have taken that day, and speaking to anyone who had seen them. But every lead seemed to dissolve into nothingness. A broken garden rake behind the shed? Already part of old debris. A set of footprints spotted by a neighbor? Vanished with the morning dew. Every supposed clue left more questions than answers. Still, some fragments refused to be ignored. A local boy had found a tiny toy shovel lodged between the roots of a pine tree just beyond the edge of the backyard. It matched the one Nora had carried that fateful morning. It was a small, almost inconsequential piece of evidence, but for the Marins it was devastating, proof that Nora had indeed ventured beyond the shed. Sheriff Daniels noted this in his reports, but admitted it was difficult to interpret. "It could have been dropped recently, it could have been there for months," he said to reporters. "Unfortunately, it doesn't provide the breakthrough we need." Strangers began appearing in town, drawn by curiosity, hope, or perhaps something darker. Amateur investigators came with metal detectors and maps marked with possible hiding spots. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed the shed might be a portal, or that Jean and Nora had been taken by something in the woods. Most were politely turned away, though some locals found their presence unnerving. Meanwhile, Claire clung to small rituals, placing freshly baked cookies on the porch, leaving little notes, and calling out to Nora as if she were just inside the house. Martin tried to maintain his work at the lumberyard, though he often found himself staring into the distance, imagining his daughter's smile or Jean's hearty laugh. Every sound in the night, a twig snapping, a distant engine, the howl of a coyote, made his heart race. The local news occasionally picked up the story, usually with updates that ended in frustration. No new leads, one headline would read. Investigation continues. Another. Yet, the town remained vigilant. Neighborhood watches grew tighter. Families spoke of keeping their children closer. The old shed behind the Marin farmhouse became a symbol of uncertainty, something both ordinary and unsettling, quietly daring the world to uncover its secrets. There were rumors, persistent, haunting whispers. Some claimed they had seen a figure lurking near the shed after sunset. Others spoke of a low rumble from the woods that no one could explain. One older neighbor insisted Jean had been protecting something in the ground, something he'd discovered years ago, and that it might have something to do with the disappearance. Most dismissed these stories as the overactive imaginations of worried townspeople, but they lingered in the back of everyone's minds. Sheriff Daniels remained methodical. He brought in forensic experts to examine the shed, the surrounding yard, and the perimeter of the property. Nothing seemed out of place. No soil disturbance. No hidden compartments. No traces of blood, hair, or clothing. It was as if Jean and Nora had simply vanished into thin air. The emotional toll on Claire and Martin was immense. Nights were the hardest, filled with dreams of walking behind the shed, calling for Nora, and finding her tiny hand slipping into Jean's. Every morning brought renewed hope and despair in equal measure. The local school teachers remembered her laughter echoing in the hallways, now haunting in its absence. Friends offered support, but even their kindness could not fill the empty spaces left by Jean and Nora. Then came a hint, subtle and easy to dismiss, that would later take on a grim significance. A neighbor mentioned seeing a small mound of dirt just beyond the shed, nearly hidden beneath weeds and wildflowers, growing slightly over the course of weeks. It seemed insignificant at the time, a natural shift of soil. Yet it marked the first trace of something buried, something that, in retrospect, was a silent clue waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. By the end of the year, 3 months into the disappearance, the case had become a fixture of the town's collective consciousness. People spoke of it in hushed tones, fearful of acknowledging what they could not explain. The shed, once a mundane part of farm life, had transformed into a symbol of dread and unanswered questions. Every glance toward it was filled with unspoken fear. What had gone wrong that day? Where were Jean and Nora? And what, if anything, lay hidden just behind that weathered structure? In the quiet of the Marin home, Claire finally allowed herself to speak aloud the words she had been holding in her heart. "I don't care what it takes," she said softly to Martin. "I will find them, even if it takes the rest of our lives." He took her hand, silent but equally determined. Neither knew that the first breakthrough was only 3 years away, hidden beneath the soil behind the shed, waiting for the right hands to dig it up. By the start of 2013, nearly a year had passed since Grandpa Jean and little Nora disappeared. The town had grown accustomed to the eerie absence, though no one spoke of it without a shiver. The Marin farmhouse still stood quietly at the edge of the woods, the old shed sagging slightly under its own weight, its paint peeling and its door stubbornly creaking in the wind. It seemed ordinary to anyone passing by, yet for those who knew what had happened, it radiated a silent menace. Claire Marin refused to stop searching. Every day, she walked the yard, examined the shed, and scanned the woods, sometimes alone, sometimes with Martin. She carried a notebook, jotting down every minor detail, every fleeting observation. One afternoon, while brushing away leaves near the back of the shed, she noticed something odd. The soil seemed slightly loose in a small, nearly invisible depression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the earth had been disturbed and partially healed over. Martin knelt beside her, brushing aside the leaves. "It's nothing," he said at first, trying to convince both himself and her. Probably just rain washing the dirt around. But neither of them could shake the uneasy feeling that something lay beneath. Around the same time, a neighbor mentioned a curious sighting, a small red scarf, partially buried near the edge of the shed, caught on a bush. It was tattered, faded, but unmistakably the same bright color Nora had loved. Claire clutched it to her chest, a mixture of hope and heartbreak washing over her. This was no ordinary discovery. It was proof that Nora had been there, perhaps struggling, perhaps hiding, or perhaps trying to leave a trace of herself. Despite these hints, police investigation remained inconclusive. Sheriff Daniels had visited the site personally, observing the small depression and the scarf, yet found no concrete evidence to follow. "It's frustrating," he admitted quietly. "We have something, but nothing that tells us who or what took them, or where they went. It's like a puzzle with half the pieces missing." Meanwhile, amateur investigators began visiting the property. Some came with metal detectors, others with small cameras and notebooks, recording everything from soil composition to unusual tree growth. One young man, fascinated by local legends, suggested that the shed itself might be a marker, that perhaps Jean and Nora had discovered something beneath it long before they disappeared. Though Claire dismissed the notion of supernatural explanations, she couldn't deny the instinctive pull she felt toward the shed and the earth behind it. The family began digging cautiously near the small mound of loose dirt, guided by a mix of intuition and desperation. It was painstaking work, careful and deliberate, scraping away layers of soil, roots, and stone. Nothing emerged at first except the ordinary debris of decades, broken glass bottles, rusty nails, remnants of old toys. Then, almost as if the earth itself had been waiting, they struck something different, a hard surface, flat and rectangular, partially covered by roots. It was the first concrete sign of a hidden secret. Claire and Martin exchanged a look of apprehension. "Could this be?" Claire whispered. Martin shook his head, unable to answer. They both knew that whatever lay beneath that surface might finally explain the unthinkable disappearance of their loved ones. The family called Sheriff Daniels, who arrived with a small team and shovels in hand. Carefully, they excavated around the object. As dirt and roots were cleared, it became clear that it was a metal container, old and rusted but intact. The sight of it sent a ripple through everyone present. Anticipation, fear, and disbelief intermingled. What could Jean and Nora have left behind, or been forced to leave behind? Before opening it, the sheriff instructed caution. "We don't know what's inside," he said. "It could be fragile, hazardous, or worse." Claire's hands trembled as she reached for the lid, a mix of dread and hope surging through her. With one slow motion, the container was opened, revealing a collection of items that would forever change the town's understanding of that day. Inside were belongings that had been with Nora, a small stuffed rabbit, her red scarf, and a crumpled notebook filled with childish drawings and notes. There were also tools and small handmade gadgets, the kind Jean loved to craft. It was immediately clear that this was no ordinary storage container. Someone had deliberately buried it, carefully, perhaps in a desperate attempt to protect or preserve something. As the items were examined, whispers ran through the small group. Could this have been Jean's doing? Had he hidden them here to protect Nora? Or had someone else intervened? The questions outnumbered the answers. But for the first time in nearly a year, there was tangible proof that Jean and Nora had indeed been near this spot, leaving behind traces that could no longer be ignored. That night, Claire sat by the empty fireplace, the container's contents spread out before her. Each item told a story, of hope, love, and perhaps a struggle that no one yet understood. She whispered into the quiet room, "We're closer now, Grandpa. We'll find you both. I promise." Little did anyone know, these discoveries were only the beginning. The true secret behind the shed, buried for years and hidden in plain sight, was far darker and far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. By the spring of 2015, nearly 3 years had passed since Grandpa Jean and little Nora disappeared. The town had grown accustomed to their absence, though the memory of that day still lingered like a shadow over the farmhouse. The shed behind the property, once a mundane structure, had become a focal point of mystery, the epicenter of unanswered questions that weighed heavily on everyone who knew the family. Claire and Martin had refused to stop looking. Every week, they visited the small mound of earth behind the shed where the rusted container had been unearthed. Though the items inside had given them hope, they had not answered the most pressing question. Where were Jean and Nora? The notebook, the scarf, the stuffed rabbit, each item spoke of the missing, but the people themselves were still gone. One chilly morning, Martin decided to dig a little deeper in the same spot. The earth was stubborn, roots weaving through the soil like veins. Claire stood nearby, hands gripping a small lantern, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any movement, any hint that someone or something was watching. With careful strokes, Martin uncovered a larger depression, one that suggested the earth had been shifted recently, though weathered by time. Sheriff Daniels and his team were called immediately. When they arrived, the sheriff's seasoned eyes widened slightly at the sight. "This wasn't visible before," he murmured, crouching to inspect the soil. "Someone or something buried this not too long ago. Or maybe it was hidden beneath layers that only now eroded enough to expose it." With meticulous care, the team began digging. Every shovelful of soil revealed fragments of objects, worn shoes, a small wooden box, and remnants of clothing. The air grew heavy with anticipation and fear. The discovery was no longer a small, innocuous container of belongings. It was something larger, something deliberately concealed. Finally, as the last layer of soil was brushed away, the team uncovered a small, sealed chamber, crudely fashioned but remarkably intact, hidden just behind the shed. It was deep enough to suggest intentional concealment and wide enough to hold at least 2 people. Claire's hands flew to her mouth, tears forming instantly. Could it really be them? After 3 years, after endless months of hope and despair, the answer seemed almost within reach. Sheriff Daniels called in forensic experts and a structural team. The chamber's lid was carefully removed, revealing the unimaginable. Inside were personal items of Jean and Nora, clothes, a small blanket, and a few of Jean's carpentry tools. There was also evidence that the two had used the space to shelter themselves for some time. The ground was flattened, and remnants of a makeshift bedding arrangement remained. Yet, there was also evidence of struggle. Scratches on the wood, disturbed soil outside the chamber, and faint, nearly imperceptible stains suggested that Jean had tried to protect Nora, perhaps even fend off an intruder. But there were no definitive signs of what had happened after they disappeared. The room was empty of life, yet it spoke volumes of fear, resilience, and desperation. For Claire and Martin, the discovery was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief that the mystery had moved from imagination to reality, heartbreak because the fate of their loved ones remained unknown. "They were here. They survived. At least for a while," Claire whispered, tracing the faint indentations in the dirt. "But where did they go? What happened after?" The community rallied immediately. Volunteers, neighbors, and investigators scoured the surrounding woods once again, hoping for any clue that might lead to the missing. But the search yielded nothing. No tracks, no signs of movement beyond the immediate area, nothing that could explain how the two had vanished from the chamber itself. Speculation spread like wildfire. Had Jean hidden them to protect Nora from someone? Had an unknown threat entered the woods? Or had nature itself forced them into hiding? Everyone had a theory, but no one had the answers. That night, Claire sat by the shed, staring at the small mound where the chamber had been hidden. The container, the scarf, and the chamber all pointed to one truth. Jean had tried to shield Nora. Someone had tried to take her away. And for 3 long years, the earth had kept their secret. It was then that a neighbor came forward with a detail that would shake the town to its core. While clearing a small path near the edge of the property, he had noticed a fresh indentation in the soil, a subtle shift as if something had been moved recently. It suggested that the mystery was not entirely in the past, that someone, perhaps even the perpetrators, might still be watching, or worse, that the story was far from over. The shed, the chamber, and the objects inside had offered answers, partial, terrifying, and emotional answers, but the greatest shock was yet to come. Whatever had been buried behind the shed for 3 years had survived the passage of time, guarding its secrets until the right hands revealed it, leaving everyone speechless, hearts pounding, and questions multiplying. The discovery of the hidden chamber behind the shed had sent ripples through the town. News crews had arrived, neighbors gathered, and the Marin family stood in stunned silence, peering at the carefully excavated space that had held their loved one's secrets for 3 long years. Every item, every scratch, and every indentation whispered a story, one of survival, fear, and the unimaginable struggle that had taken place in that small, hidden corner of the yard. For Claire and Martin, the chamber was a bittersweet revelation. The fact that Jean had managed to shield Nora, even in a desperate situation, was heartening. Yet the chamber was empty, the two still missing. How they had left it, where they had gone, and what had forced them to vanish remained a haunting question. It was then that Sheriff Daniels noticed something peculiar: faint tracks leading away from the chamber, partially obscured by debris and fallen leaves. The tracks were small, delicate, likely Nora's, alongside larger, deliberate prints, presumably Jean's. They trailed toward the dense thicket beyond the shed, disappearing into the forest as if the two had been guided away, perhaps by fear, necessity, or someone unknown. The investigation intensified. Forensic teams examined the chamber and surrounding soil, finding traces of organic material and fibers that suggested the two had been forced to take refuge there for an extended period. There were remnants of hand-carved tools, bits of fabric, and small drawings Nora had made, little cries for help frozen in time. Every detail painted a vivid picture of the hours, and possibly days, they had spent in hiding. Neighbors came forward with small but crucial observations. One elderly farmer recalled seeing Jean carrying a small crate toward the shed the week before the disappearance, a crate he claimed contained important things for safekeeping. Another neighbor remembered hearing faint laughter and then, later, urgent whispers that suggested Jean was trying to calm Nora while someone or something approached. These fragments, when pieced together, formed a chilling mosaic. Jean had known they were in danger, and he had acted to protect his granddaughter in the only way he could. Then came the moment that left everyone speechless. While carefully sifting through the backfill, investigators uncovered a concealed trapdoor beneath loose boards in the chamber's floor. It led to a narrow, shallow tunnel that extended into the woods. Inside were items Jean had apparently hidden: blankets, non-perishable food, and personal effects, all arranged as though someone had intended to survive there for an extended period. It became clear that Jean and Nora had used this hidden space not only as a temporary refuge but as a carefully prepared hiding place. Whoever or whatever had threatened them had driven them underground, literally and figuratively, until they could escape. But there was still no sign of them. Sheriff Daniels addressed the assembled crowd. "Everything we found indicates that Jean and Nora were incredibly resourceful. This chamber was meant to protect them, and it did, for some time. But it also shows us the lengths they had to go to avoid whoever was after them. What happened after? We can only speculate. But the evidence is real. It's here, and it's undeniable." In the weeks that followed, investigators continued to search the surrounding woods, following the faint trail of footprints leading away from the chamber. Though Jean and Nora were not immediately found, the discovery behind the shed provided the first tangible evidence of their ordeal. Families across town began to view the story as a cautionary tale, not just of disappearance, but of resilience, resourcefulness, and the unseen battles that can unfold in the quietest corners of life. Finally, one late afternoon, Claire stood by the shed, the wind ruffling her hair. She traced her fingers over the soil that had concealed so many secrets, thinking of the years of fear, searching, and unanswered questions. A small smile broke through her tears. "You fought for each other," she whispered. "And for that, we'll never forget you." The shed behind the farmhouse remained unchanged on the surface, weathered, quiet, and ordinary. But beneath its worn boards, it held a story of courage, survival, and unbreakable love. It was a story that would echo through the town for years, leaving everyone speechless at the lengths one grandfather would go to protect his granddaughter, and at the enduring mystery of what became of them after the earth finally gave up its secrets. The discovery behind the shed had changed everything, and yet, in many ways, it changed nothing. The hidden chamber, the tunnel, and the items left behind were proof of the struggle, resilience, and love between Grandpa Gene and little Nora. They had endured, protected one another, and left a trail that finally told the story of their disappearance. But the ultimate question remained: where were they now? For Claire and Martin, the truth was both a relief and a heartbreak. They no longer had to wonder if Gene had failed to protect Nora, or if something terrible had gone unnoticed behind the shed. The evidence showed that he had fought, that they had survived together, at least for a time. And yet, the void in their hearts could not be filled. The world outside the Marin farmhouse remained unaware of the full story, seeing only an ordinary shed, unaware of the extraordinary ordeal it had concealed. The town slowly returned to its rhythm, though the shed remained a silent reminder of what had transpired. Neighbors still glanced toward it with a shiver, children avoided the small mound of earth behind it, and the Marin family's tale became a legend, a story of courage, secrecy, and enduring love that would echo for years to come. Some mysteries are never fully solved. Some disappearances leave questions that haunt the imagination. And sometimes, the answers we uncover bring both clarity and heartbreak in equal measure. But for those who knew the truth, the shed was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was a testament to survival, to determination, and to the unbreakable bond between a grandfather and his granddaughter. As the sun set behind the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the yard, Claire whispered to the wind, "We will never forget you, Grandpa, Nora, and one day we will find you." And in that moment, the story of the shed, the chamber, and the courage it concealed became immortal, leaving everyone who heard it utterly speechless.